The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. The crowd that had once rushed around Marcus now seemed to stop in their tracks, frozen by the rawness of the situation unfolding before them. Passengers who had been too preoccupied with their own schedules, their own destinations, now stood still, some of them staring at Marcus with wide eyes, others turning their phones on in disbelief. It was as if a switch had been flipped. What had started as a simple check-in had now become a confrontation with something much larger than just an airline's bureaucracy. Walter, visibly uncomfortable, continued to fumble with his phone. Marcus could see the man's eyes darting back and forth between the screen and the growing crowd. It was clear that Walter was trying to navigate through a situation that had spiraled beyond his control, but the more he tried to handle it, the more the pressure mounted. It wasn't just about policies anymore. It wasn't even about the fallen soldier, though that remained at the heart of it all. This was now a test of something bigger: integrity, honor, and the systems that claimed to protect those values. Walter finally made a move, stepping back and addressing Marcus once again. But this time, his words were softer, tinged with uncertainty. "Colonel Jackson," he began, but his voice wavered slightly. "We understand the importance of what you're doing, but I'm afraid our hands are tied. The system simply won't allow it." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, unmoving. His eyes never left Walter, and there was a quiet, powerful intensity in his gaze. He was a man who had witnessed the worst the world had to offer: the violence, the chaos, the loss, yet he remained unshaken. In this moment, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He wasn't fighting for the respect he had earned through decades of service. He was fighting for the memory of Private Thomas Ellis, a young man whose life had been cut short too soon. And he was fighting for every soldier who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or ignored simply because they didn't fit the mold of what society expected. Amanda, who had been silent for the last few moments, finally looked up from her screen, her eyes uncertain. She could feel the tension growing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She was no longer just a clerk following procedures. She was now a part of something bigger, a symbol of a system that was failing its own people. But what could she do? She was just doing her job, wasn't she? The words of policy and system had been drilled into her for years. What more could she offer than what was expected? But as she looked at Marcus, something shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was there. Her gaze softened ever so slightly. Perhaps she realized what had been missing in her own life: the sense of duty, the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. It wasn't just about following the rules anymore. It was about having the courage to question those rules when they led to injustice. Still, she said nothing. She simply hovered behind the counter, caught in the grip of the situation, too afraid to speak up, yet too aware of the injustice unfolding in front of her. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't even an antagonist. She was a cog in a system that had long been blind to the very people it claimed to serve. And in that moment, the system itself was under fire. Marcus's voice broke the silence again. It was calm, firm, but tinged with the weight of a lifetime of experience. "This is not about policy," he said, his voice cutting through the growing noise in the terminal. "This is about respect. This is about the honor we owe to those who have given everything for this country. I have worked with the TSA, with every major airport you can think of. I know the procedures, I know how things work. This is not a system error. This is a human error. You don't want to help because of who I am." Walter shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward the passengers who had begun to gather around Marcus. He could feel the weight of their gazes, each one heavy with judgment, each one questioning the actions of the airline staff. The power of the moment was undeniable. In every corner of the terminal, heads were turning. The hum of the airport had gone silent, replaced by the low murmur of passengers whispering, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. A few more seconds passed, and then a voice rang out. It was an older man, his voice raspy, but filled with authority. "I served 30 years, he said, his tone stern, his eyes fixed on the airline staff. "And I've never seen a soldier on duty get stopped like this." Who do you think you're messing with? The words hit like a hammer, cutting through the tension in the terminal. The crowd responded immediately, the anger and disbelief shifting from a quiet murmur to an undeniable outcry. The man who had spoken, Charles Baker, a former Marine who had fought in Vietnam, stepped forward, his chest puffed out with pride, his face set in a firm, unwavering expression. "This is disgraceful," he continued. "How dare you treat a man in uniform like this?" The crowd began to shift, and suddenly the moment had taken on a life of its own. People who had once been passive observers were now actively engaged, their voices rising in unison with Charles Baker's. One by one, people began to step forward, their phones held high, capturing the injustice that was unfolding before them. The story was being told in real time, not by the news media, but by the very people who were witnessing it firsthand. Amanda, standing behind the counter, could feel the weight of the growing outrage. The fear that had once kept her quiet now surged through her, and she was no longer sure which side of this conflict she was on. She had followed the rules all her life, but now, standing there, she realized that the rules weren't enough. They weren't a shield against what was right. One by one, people began to speak out. A young man, holding a phone high, began live streaming the situation, his voice loud and filled with righteous indignation. "You're watching live from JFK," he said, his voice filled with anger. "A U.S. Army colonel is being refused boarding while escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. What on earth is happening here?" The comments on his stream came in fast and furious, each one filled with disbelief and outrage. The hashtag Let Him Fly began to spread like wildfire, gaining traction across social media platforms. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook exploded with posts from people who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The story had gone viral, and there was no turning back. Amanda looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the pressure mounting on her, but there was nowhere to hide. The airline's corporate defenses had crumbled, and now there was nowhere left to retreat. She had been following protocol, but now, in the face of so many voices speaking out, she realized that protocol alone couldn't justify the treatment Marcus was receiving. Walter, flustered and unsure of what to do next, turned toward the back office. He began to whisper urgently to someone on the other side of the glass door, but Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch. He stood there, calm and unyielding, like a rock in the middle of a storm. It wasn't long before more people joined in. The crowd at the counter had swelled, and now the tension was palpable. Even as the voices of protest grew louder, Marcus remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. His presence, the simple dignity with which he carried himself, was speaking louder than any words could. A few minutes later, an officer in a dark blue uniform, his expression grave, emerged from the back. He was Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Thomas, representing the Army Command from the Pentagon. His arrival sent a shockwave through the terminal. The crowd, which had been simmering with indignation, fell silent. They knew what this meant. This wasn't just any officer. This was a senior officer, someone who had the authority to cut through the bureaucracy and make things right. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas walked straight up to the counter, his shoes clicking with purpose against the marble floor. Without a word, he stood at attention in front of Marcus, saluted him, and addressed the airline staff with an authority that left no room for further argument. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Thomas, representing Army Command from the Pentagon," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "We are aware of what has occurred. Colonel Jackson and Private Ellis will not be flying commercial. A military aircraft is on standby. A C-4A from Andrews Air Force Base has been dispatched on an emergency order. The crew is ready. You may board at any time." The weight of his words settled over the terminal, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, there was a sense of resolution. The silent battle, which had begun as a quiet confrontation at a check-in counter, was now over. The system had been exposed for what it was: flawed, biased, and unwilling to do what was right when it mattered most. Marcus turned to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas, his expression one of quiet gratitude. He nodded slightly, accepting the orders. With the same dignity that had guided him throughout his career, no applause, no cheers. Just the simple understanding that, in this moment, justice had been served. As the last words from Lieutenant Colonel Thomas echoed across the bustling terminal, the atmosphere shifted. The immediate storm of tension seemed to dissipate, but the reverberations of what had just occurred continued to grow. For Marcus Jackson, this wasn't a victory. It wasn't even a resolution. It was simply a moment of integrity, a fleeting glimpse of justice amidst a system that had long ignored what was right. As he turned away from the check-in counter, the eyes of everyone around him followed, some filled with awe, others with resentment. But all of them were witnessing something that would change the trajectory of the day, and perhaps something much more. The news had spread like wildfire. Within minutes of the confrontation, a young woman, who had been streaming the incident live on her phone, had already shared her footage across social media platforms. Hashtags like #LetHimFly and #HonorOurSoldiers began to surface on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. By the time Marcus left the counter, the viral wave had begun. This wasn't just about a fallen soldier's return home anymore. This was about a nation awakening to an injustice they had largely ignored, a microcosm of the larger, systemic issues at play. As Marcus and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas made their way to the military aircraft, the tension in the terminal began to shift toward a different kind of energy. The group of passengers that had stood in stunned silence began to speak among themselves, their voices rising in frustration and disbelief. In every corner of the airport, travelers had been transformed from passive onlookers into active participants. In a moment they had never expected, one by one, more people began to speak out, their voices a chorus of indignation. A middle-aged woman who had been quietly waiting for her flight stepped forward. Her face was a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She turned to a nearby traveler and said, "If he were a white soldier, would they have treated him like this? If he didn't wear a uniform, would he be standing here now, fighting for the respect he deserves?" Her question hung in the air, as powerful as the silence that had followed it. It wasn't just about the policies of national jet airlines anymore. It wasn't just about a missed flight or a paperwork snafu. It was about race. It was about honor. It was about something much deeper that people had long been unwilling to confront. Another passenger, a tall man with graying hair, spoke up. "I've been traveling for years, and I've never seen anything like this," he said, shaking his head. "This man's service, his sacrifice, and this airline is treating him like this." His voice cracked with anger. "This isn't about some technicality. This is about disrespect. This is about prejudice." Behind the check-in counter, Amanda, the young woman who had been at the center of the confrontation, stood frozen. She had not expected any of this. When she had first processed the documents and begun typing into the system, she had never imagined that it would escalate to this point. She hadn't realized, at least not at the time, how much was riding on this moment. Now, as the crowd around the counter swelled, she could feel their eyes on her. The weight of their gaze was palpable, and for the first time since the incident had begun, she felt something close to shame, the emotion she had so carefully suppressed in order to get through the day now broke free, washing over her in a wave of discomfort. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't the enemy. But in this moment, she was part of a larger system that had failed Marcus Jackson. And, perhaps more painfully, she had been a part of the system that had failed every soldier who had ever been treated with the same cold disregard. Walter Glay, the operations supervisor, had also been feeling the weight of the situation. His back was stiff, his eyes darting back and forth as if looking for an escape. When he had first walked into the situation, his purpose had been clear: to handle a routine check-in and send Marcus on his way. He had never expected it to unravel so quickly, but now, as Marcus's dignified silence hung in the air like a heavy mist, Walter realized just how deep the issue ran. It wasn't just about his position in the company. It wasn't even about whether or not Marcus would get on the flight. It was about the fact that there were thousands, perhaps millions of people out there watching, waiting and demanding justice. And this moment would be remembered for much longer than a simple airline delay. The storm grows as Marcus and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas walked toward the tarmac. A sense of calm had settled around them. They knew that the situation was far from over, but for now, there was a quiet understanding that, at least for this moment, the system had failed, but they had not. Their mission was still intact. Their duty, after all, was not just to Private Ellis, but to something much bigger, the honor and memory of every soldier who had served and given everything. But in the terminal, the storm was just beginning. As soon as the video of Marcus's stand began to spread, it was met with an outpouring of support from across the country. Social media erupted with anger and frustration, but also with a rallying cry for justice. People who had never met Marcus, who had never heard of Private Ellis, suddenly felt a connection to the struggle. It was as if they, too, had been wronged. It was as if they, too, were standing at that check-in counter, fighting for something. Bigger than themselves, veterans groups were some of the first to respond. Within minutes of the video hitting social media, the National Veterans Organization, NVO, issued a statement calling for an investigation into National Jet's treatment of Marcus. They denounced the airline's actions and called for immediate accountability, not just for the staff involved, but for the culture of indifference that allowed such treatment to occur in the first place. Their statement resonated with millions across the country. People who had been silent about the invisible discrimination they had experienced in their own lives were now speaking out. The narrative had shifted from a simple airline dispute to something much more profound. It was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about the kind of treatment that every man and woman in uniform deserved, regardless of their race, their background, or their position in society. The backlash against National Jet was swift and unrelenting. The hashtag Let Him Fly continued to climb in the ranks on Twitter, and the outrage on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok was overwhelming. Within hours, the incident was being covered by news outlets across the nation. CNN, Fox News, and NBC all ran reports on what had happened at JFK Airport, each one analyzing the deeper implications of the event. Was this a simple case of a miscommunication? Or was it something darker, something ingrained within the very systems meant to serve the public? Marcus had been silent through it all. He had given no interviews, issued no statements, and posted nothing on social media. His focus had been on one thing and one thing only, completing his mission and bringing Private Ellis home. The silence spoke volumes, though. It was a silence that resonated with the pain of a lifetime of service, a silence that spoke to the injustice not just of this moment, but of a history too long ignored. And now, as the media coverage intensified, it became clear that Marcus Jackson had unwittingly become the face of something much larger. He had become the symbol of every soldier who had ever been overlooked, discriminated against, or belittled because of their race or their background. And as the nation watched, it was impossible to ignore the larger conversation that was beginning to unfold. But even as Marcus's story spread across the nation, the airline was in damage control mode. National Jet's public relations team was scrambling to issue statements, trying to contain the fallout. The CEO, Evelyn Grant, had yet to make a public appearance, and her absence was becoming a glaring issue. The company's stock began to plummet, and cancellations of flights were pouring in. The MVO called for a nationwide boycott of the airline. Other veterans organizations quickly joined in. Soon, military families, who had once flown National Jet without a second thought, were canceling reservations and urging others to do the same. The airline's failure to properly handle the situation and its inability to respond with the respect that Marcus Jackson deserved had exposed it as a company out of touch with the very values it claimed to uphold. The accountability crisis. National Jet was now in full crisis mode. The public's outrage was growing, and the viral videos circulating on social media had become a major headache for the airline. At its headquarters, executives scrambled to put together a response. The PR team worked overtime to draft statements and prepare interviews, but it was clear that nothing they said could undo the damage. Inside the executive offices, whispers of resignation began to circulate. Executives were facing a rebellion from both within the company and outside it. The airline's reputation had been shattered. Their stock had dropped 9% in a single trading session, wiping out billions of dollars in market capitalization. And worse, veterans groups had rallied together to demand justice for Marcus Jackson. As the days passed, the protests outside National Jet's headquarters intensified. Small groups of veterans, military families, and concerned citizens gathered, with signs that read, "Honor our soldiers and let him fly." The hashtag let him fly became a rallying cry, a symbol of the collective frustration over years of invisible discrimination. Inside National Jet's headquarters, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. It was clear that action needed to be taken. Their first decision, Evelyn Grant, the CEO, was placed on indefinite leave. She had failed to address the situation quickly enough, and her leadership was now being questioned. A new interim CEO was appointed, someone who was tasked with restoring the company's damaged reputation and handling the fallout from the incident. But even as the company worked to rebuild, it was clear that Marcus Jackson's story had already left an indelible mark on the nation. The media continued to cover the incident, and every day new developments emerged. The NVO had called for a full investigation, and various government agencies were now looking into the airline's practices. The question on everyone's mind was, how many people had been treated like this before, and how many more would be treated this way in the future? The days following the incident at JFK Airport became a whirlwind. What had started as a routine act of military duty, a final journey to bring home Private First Class Thomas Ellis, had evolved into a national outcry that no one could have predicted. National Jet Airlines, the airline at the heart of the controversy, was now at the center of a media firestorm. The viral videos of Marcus Jackson standing firm against a system that had denied him respect had spread across social media and news outlets, sparking outrage and calls for justice from all corners of the country. The moment Marcus had stood resolute at the check-in counter, refusing to back down, became a symbol, not just of one man's dignity, but of the dignity owed to every soldier who had ever served this nation. His silence, his unwavering calm in the face of the airline's unjust refusal, spoke volumes. But it wasn't just Marcus's courage that had made headlines. It was the way in which the public had rallied behind him. People from all walks of life, veterans, civilians, and even people who had never met Marcus or Private Ellis, found themselves drawn to the story. The injustice they saw was not just an isolated event. It was a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue that they could no longer ignore. The public awakens as the hours passed. The hashtag let him fly and hashtag honor our soldiers began trending across social media platforms. The initial shock from the viral videos gave way to a rising tide of public outrage. People were now demanding accountability, not just from National Jet, but from a society that had allowed such treatment to persist for so long. Veterans groups, who had long been pushing for better recognition and respect for those who served, saw this as an opportunity to finally draw attention to the systemic inequalities they had been speaking about for years. The National Veterans Organization, NVO, was one of the first to issue a statement. It was a strong condemnation of National Jet's actions and a call to action for all veterans and military families to stand together. The NVO demanded an official investigation into the airline's discriminatory practices and the mistreatment of Marcus Jackson. They also called for an apology from the airline to both Marcus and the family of Private Ellis, and for the airline to make significant changes in their internal policies to ensure that no military personnel would ever face the kind of humiliation that Marcus had endured. We cannot sit idly by when the honor of our fallen heroes is trampled on by an indifferent system, the statement read. This is not just about one man's dignity. This is about the dignity of every soldier who has ever fought for this country. The statement resonated with millions. Veterans from across the nation shared their own stories of mistreatment and discrimination, from subtle biases to outright prejudice. The hashtag let him fly and hashtag honor our soldiers weren't just calls for justice for Marcus. They became a symbol for the struggles that countless others had faced in silence. The country had been watching this unfold in real time, and they were no longer willing to look away. The media coverage of the incident escalated quickly. What had started as a single viral video posted by a young woman at JFK had now snowballed into a full-blown news story. CNN, Fox News, NBC, and other major outlets all ran stories on the incident, each one delving deeper into the details of what had happened. They interviewed veterans, military experts, and even some airline industry insiders, all of whom condemned the airline for its treatment of Marcus Jackson. How is it possible that a man who has dedicated his life to serving this country is treated like this? One veteran who had served in Afghanistan asked during a live interview. It's not just about the flight. It's about the disrespect that soldiers face on a daily basis, and it's time we start talking about it. As the media coverage grew, the public's response became even more forceful. National Jet, which had initially hoped to weather the storm with a few press releases, found itself in full damage control mode. Executives scrambled to respond to the growing public pressure, but nothing they said seemed to calm the rising anger. The airline issued a series of statements apologizing for the incident, but their words rang hollow to many. It was becoming clear that this was no longer about just one airline's failure. It was about a culture of indifference that had permeated much of corporate America, and the public was no longer willing to accept it. The call for action within 48 hours of the incident. A petition began circulating online. The petition, titled "Demand National Jet Be Held Accountable for Humiliating a Military Officer," quickly gained traction. Thousands of signatures poured in, with people from across the nation expressing their outrage and their support for Marcus Jackson. The petition demanded that National Jet not only apologize but also take concrete steps to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. The petition was widely shared on social media, and soon it was being picked up by major news outlets. Local news stations across the country began interviewing veterans and military families, many of whom shared similar experiences of being treated with disrespect or indifference. The issue, once confined to a single incident at JFK, was now a full-scale national conversation about how military personnel, especially people of color, were treated in society. In Washington, the story was beginning to make waves. Several members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, issued statements of support for Marcus Jackson. Senator William H. Carter of Maryland and Representative Rebecca Lang of Texas, both veterans themselves, condemned National Jet for its actions and called for a full investigation into the airline's practices. For too long, the men and women who serve this country have been treated with a lack of respect, Senator Carter said in a statement. This incident at JFK is just the tip of the iceberg. We must ensure that our military personnel are treated with the dignity they deserve at all times, whether they are on duty or not. The pressure mounts on National Jet's response to the growing public outcry was predictable, but it was also too little, too late. The airline initially issued a generic statement apologizing for the incident, blaming it on a technical issue and promising to investigate the matter. However, the public was having none of it. They saw right through the empty words and demanded real accountability. They demanded not just an apology, but a fundamental change in how military personnel were treated by the airline industry. By the third day after the incident, the backlash had reached a fever pitch. National Jet's stock price began to drop precipitously. Investors were spooked by the mounting public outrage, and the company's executives were scrambling to contain the fallout. In response to the growing crisis, the airline's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Inside the boardroom, the pressure was palpable. The company was facing the worst public relations crisis in its history, and there was no easy way out. Outside the corporate headquarters, protests began to form. Veterans, military families, and concerned citizens gathered in front of the building, waving flags and holding signs that read, "Respect our soldiers, honor the fallen, and let him fly." The protests were peaceful, but they sent a clear message. National Jet's failure to properly honor Marcus Jackson and the memory of Private Ellis would not go unnoticed. People from all walks of life, including those who had never traveled with National Jet, were now standing in solidarity, demanding change. The protests, combined with the growing media frenzy and the viral spread of the videos, put National Jet in a precarious position. Behind closed doors, the executives were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a bad day for the company. This was about a failure to uphold the basic principles of respect, honor, and dignity that every soldier deserved. A turning point, the final turning point came when an internal email was leaked to the press. The email, sent by a mid-level manager at National Jet, instructed staff to remain silent and avoid making any comments to the media about the incident. It was a clear attempt to bury the story and deflect responsibility. But the leak only fueled the public's anger. The email was widely circulated, and the public saw it for what it was: an attempt by the airline to cover up its failures and avoid taking responsibility. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and even corporate accountability advocates began to demand a full investigation into National Jet's internal policies. The company's leadership was being held accountable not just for the actions of the staff involved in the JFK incident, but for the systemic issues that had allowed such a breach of military dignity to occur in the first place. Within a week, National Jet's CEO, Evelyn Grant, had become the focal point of the crisis. She had remained largely silent during the initial days of the controversy, offering only vague statements of apology. But as the pressure mounted, it became clear that her leadership was under scrutiny. Shareholders began calling for her resignation, and it was evident that the company would have to make significant changes if it wanted to survive this scandal. The stock market reacted accordingly, and the airline's value continued to plummet. Cancellations of flights surged, with many customers expressing that they would never fly with National Jet again. A soldier's honor. Meanwhile, Marcus Jackson remained resolute. He had completed his mission, bringing Private Ellis home. The family of the young soldier had received the closure they needed, but Marcus had not sought public recognition for his actions. He had completed his duty, just as he always had. His focus had always been on those who served with him and those who came before him. The outpouring of support for him wasn't what he sought, but he understood the significance of it. It was a reminder to the nation that the men and women in uniform deserved respect, not just in times of war but in all aspects of life. He had no intention of engaging with the media or making public statements. For Marcus, his actions spoke for themselves. He had seen too much in his 34 years of service to seek recognition or accolades. What mattered to him was that the young men and women who served, like Private Ellis, were treated with the respect and honor they deserved, not just in life, but in death as well. The silence in the airport was now filled with a growing sense of disbelief. Marcus Jackson, though still standing tall, had now become a symbol of more than just a single military officer's struggle. His quiet dignity, unwavering in the face of bureaucracy, had sparked a wave of outrage that the nation could no longer ignore. The sight of a man who had served his country for decades being treated with disrespect at the hands of a system meant to serve him, and others like him, had triggered something profound within the public. It wasn't just about the refusal of boarding anymore. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue that no one had been willing to address for years. The media had picked up the story, as expected, and it didn't take long before every major news outlet had reported on the incident. The viral video was everywhere. The footage of Marcus standing resolute at the check-in counter, his chest adorned with the medals that represented a lifetime of service. The hashtags that followed, #LetHimFly and #HonorOurSoldiers, dominated social media, reaching millions of people who were now witnessing a collective outcry. The story wasn't just a personal battle for Marcus. It was a battle for the dignity of every soldier who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or worse, humiliated because of their service. National Jet's response had been clumsy at best. Their initial statement, released the day after the incident, attempted to downplay the situation, labeling it as a technical error. The company insisted that they were reviewing internal procedures, but there was no apology, no recognition of the deeper implications of what had transpired. As the days wore on, the public grew more disillusioned with the company's indifference. People were no longer simply angry at an airline's mistake. They were furious at the system that allowed such disrespect to happen in the first place. The country was waking up to a reality they had ignored for too long: systemic indifference to those who served in the military, and worse, an entrenched culture of discrimination that often went unnoticed unless it was too late. The story had crossed every boundary. Political leaders from both parties had weighed in. In the Senate and the House, veterans spoke out, condemning National Jet for its actions and calling for accountability. Representative Rebecca Lang of Texas had issued a powerful statement demanding an investigation into the airline's policies, while Senator William H. Carter, a veteran himself, expressed his outrage at the treatment of Marcus Jackson, calling it a disgrace to the service and sacrifice of every soldier who has ever worn the uniform. What had been a momentary act of defiance in a busy airport had now become the catalyst for a nationwide conversation. People across the country were coming forward with their own stories of military personnel being treated with indifference, or worse, of being pushed aside simply because they wore a uniform. The conversation wasn't just about what had happened to Marcus Jackson. It was about what had been happening for years under the radar. The stories of these men and women, often ignored or dismissed as just part of the job, were now being brought to the forefront. The public outcry was more than just about this one incident. It was about an entire system that needed to change. In the midst of all this, Marcus Jackson had become a quiet, powerful voice for change. He had refused to engage with the media. He had not issued a statement, nor had he appeared on television to bask in the public's admiration. His focus remained on his mission, on completing the task that had brought him to the airport in the first place, bringing Private Ellis home. The honor he had given to his fellow soldier was his ultimate priority, not the media frenzy surrounding him. Yet, despite his silence, his actions were speaking louder than any words could. By standing firm, by holding his ground in the face of systemic injustice, Marcus had made a statement that resonated across the country. He had become a symbol of quiet strength and dignity, and in the process, he had forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about how those who served were treated when the cameras weren't on them. In the days following the incident, the protests outside National Jet's headquarters grew. What had started as a small group of veterans and military families demanding accountability turned into a full-fledged rally. People from across the country, many of whom had never even flown with National Jet, had joined the protests, voicing their frustration and demanding that the airline take responsibility. The media, now fully immersed in the story, was broadcasting live from outside the company's headquarters, capturing the tension that had become a focal point for public outrage. But it wasn't just veterans who were standing in solidarity. Ordinary citizens, some of whom had never served in the military, were now joining the cause. They were tweeting about it, posting on Facebook, and even taking to the streets. The issue wasn't just about one airline or one man. It had become a fight for dignity, respect, and equality. It was a fight that transcended the military and touched the hearts of those who saw something deeply wrong in how service members were treated in their everyday lives. The protesters, some holding signs reading "Honor our soldiers and respect the fallen," were demanding change not just from National Jet, but from the society that had allowed this to happen. Inside the boardrooms of National Jet, executives were scrambling. The stock price had dropped by nearly 15% in the wake of the incident, and the company's reputation was in tatters. It wasn't just a minor crisis anymore. It had become an existential threat to the airline. The damage was far greater than they had anticipated, and the public response was relentless. National Jet had underestimated the public's appetite for justice. They had assumed that with a few polite apologies and a promise to review their procedures, they could quell the storm. But now it was clear the airline was under siege, and the only way out was to confront the issue head-on in a last-ditch effort to mitigate the damage. The airline's board called an emergency meeting. CEO Evelyn Grant, who had been largely silent in the days following the incident, was now under intense scrutiny. She had failed to address the public's concerns quickly enough, and the company's board members were starting to question her ability to lead them through this crisis. The board, aware of the growing pressure from both the media and the public, began discussing the possibility of her resignation. The talk in the room was tense, as the executives tried to figure out how they could salvage the company's image. Some suggested issuing a stronger apology. Others recommended paying for a special ceremony to honor Marcus and Private Ellis. But no one seemed to have a solution that would restore the airline's trust with the public. As the conversation turned more toward damage control, Marcus remained focused on what mattered most, bringing Private Ellis home. The growing media frenzy and the public outcry were distant echoes to him. He had heard the promises of change before, had witnessed too many corporate apologies that amounted to nothing. His priority was simple: to ensure that Ellis was laid to rest with the honor and dignity he deserved. The rest was noise, fleeting and irrelevant. The protests at National Jet's headquarters continued, with more and more people joining the cause. As the days wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a temporary outburst of anger. This was the beginning of a larger movement, one that would force change not only within the airline industry, but in the way society viewed and treated its veterans. And it was clear, too, that National Jet would not be able to move past this incident without making real changes. The days of ignoring the mistreatment of military personnel were over. The public had spoken, and now the airline would have to listen. Marcus Jackson's name was being spoken across the country, but he wasn't interested in fame or glory. His concern had always been the same: honor, duty, and the men and women who had served beside him. As for National Jet, their struggle was just beginning. The public wasn't going to let this go, and neither was Marcus. His actions had sparked something much bigger than an airline dispute. They had sparked a national reckoning, one that would not be silenced by corporate apologies or superficial gestures. This fight was just getting started. The protests outside National Jet's headquarters had only intensified. Every day more people showed up. Veterans, military families, and citizens who had no personal connection to the airline stood shoulder to shoulder, all united in one common cause: demanding accountability for the disrespect shown to Colonel Marcus Jackson and Private First Class Thomas Ellis. National Jet's corporate headquarters, once a place of calm business dealings, had transformed into a battleground where justice, respect, and honor were being fiercely contested. Inside the company, the tension was palpable. Senior executives scrambled to come up with a solution, but they were running out of time. With every passing hour, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The airline's stock continued to plummet and customer cancellations flooded in. More and more people were voicing their intent to never fly with National Jet again, not just because of this incident, but because of the systemic failure it represented. The media was relentless in its coverage. News outlets from across the world continued to highlight the story, putting the airline under a global microscope. It was no longer just about an isolated case of a soldier being mistreated. It was about the larger, ugly truth that had been exposed, a culture of indifference and prejudice that was too deeply ingrained to be ignored any longer. The helm of the crisis was National Jet's CEO, Evelyn Grant. After days of silence, she had finally agreed to make a public appearance. The pressure had been building on her to speak out, to take responsibility, and to address the growing public outcry. As she prepared to face the cameras, the weight of the moment hung heavy on her shoulders. She had been the face of the company. Through this debacle, and her failure to respond quickly enough had made her a target for both the public and the media. The once high-powered CEO now seemed like a deer caught in headlights, aware of the mounting pressure to salvage the company's reputation. As Evelyn entered the boardroom, her face was a mask of calm, but anyone who looked closely could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The board members were already seated, murmuring quietly among themselves. Their eyes were all on her, awaiting her to make the first move. "How do we fix this?" one of the board members asked, breaking the silence. "We're losing control. We've been apologizing, but nothing's working." The The media is not letting up, and the public's response is growing louder by the minute. We need a solution, and fast. Evelyn nodded slowly, her mind racing. She had spent hours reviewing the company's response strategy, but it was clear that no one, including herself, had foreseen the full scale of the fallout. She had expected some backlash, of course, but the level of outrage and the speed with which it had spread had caught her off guard. The public was no longer interested in apologies. They wanted real, tangible change. And National Jet, it seemed, was too entrenched in its corporate policies and indifference to give it to them. We need to show the public that we're serious about addressing the systemic issues that have led to this, Evelyn said, her voice steady, though there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. This is no longer just about this one incident. It's about how we treat our military personnel, how we respect them, and how we handle situations when those values are violated. We can't just issue another apology and hope it all blows over. Another board member, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a stern expression, spoke up. I agree, but what can we do now? The damage has already been done. People are canceling their flights by the thousands, and the social media backlash is overwhelming. If we don't do something drastic, we'll lose everything. Our customers, our reputation, our credibility? Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temples. She had always prided herself on being able to handle crises, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a public relations issue. This was a matter of honor, a matter of respect, things that couldn't be easily fixed with corporate rhetoric. We need a public apology, a real one, Evelyn said finally, her tone resolute. And we need to make concrete changes. We need to overhaul our policies, especially when it comes to handling military personnel. We need to show the world that we understand the magnitude of what's happened. And we need to start with a commitment to do better. The room fell silent. As the board members absorbed her words, it was clear that some were skeptical, but they all understood that their options were running out. The decision had to be made quickly, and it had to be genuine. The media, meanwhile, was having a field day with National Jet's response. Every major outlet had covered the story extensively, and the interviews with veterans, military families, and civil rights groups were pouring in. The outrage had taken on a life of its own. Celebrities were speaking out, sharing their support for Marcus Jackson and criticizing the airline. One prominent figure, actor Michael Rendell, posted on social media, "This isn't just about an airline. This is about the treatment of the men and women who protect our freedom. They deserve better." Even politicians, regardless of their party affiliation, had started to weigh in. Senator William H. Carter from Maryland, a former Army officer, made a public statement calling the incident a national disgrace. We've seen how the military is treated by the public, but what happened to Colonel Jackson was a wake-up call, he said. It's time we ask ourselves as a nation why this keeps happening. Why are the very people who protect us, who put their lives on the line, treated with such indifference when they return home? This is a moral failing, and it needs to be addressed. The media storm surrounding the incident had far-reaching effects. People from all walks of life were talking about it. People who had never given much thought to the treatment of veterans were now grappling with a hard truth that the system they had relied on for so long wasn't working. Whether it was due to indifference, bias, or systemic prejudice, the fact remained that the nation's veterans were often left to fend for themselves. And now they had been forced to confront that reality head-on, back at JFK Airport. The situation had begun to settle, but it was clear that this incident was far from over. Marcus Jackson had completed his mission, and Private Ellis was now at rest, but Marcus's legacy had already taken root. He had become a symbol of resilience in the face of institutional failure, of quiet defiance in the face of systemic injustice. And while Marcus had no intention of becoming a symbol for anything, his actions had ignited something in the public. He had shown them that silence in the face of wrong was no longer acceptable. Meanwhile, the fallout continued to grow. National Jet's executives had convened yet again, but this time there was no easy solution. The public wasn't going to Let this go. They had seen the truth, and they wanted more than just corporate assurances. They wanted a reckoning. They wanted change. The pressure was mounting, and there was no longer any doubt in anyone's mind that National Jet would have to pay for its negligence. Whether it was through a complete overhaul of their policies, an apology to Marcus Jackson and the Ellis family, or a combination of both. The company was now at a crossroads. National Jet's crisis had escalated to a full-blown disaster, and there were no quick fixes. What had started as a small mistake, a failure of protocol, had turned into a nationwide movement. The entire world was watching, and the question now was not just how National Jet would recover from this incident. It was whether or not the company could repair the damage to its soul. The once invincible corporation now found itself facing an existential threat. The public, who had once been loyal customers, were now demanding justice. And as the nation's gaze remained fixed on National Jet, it was clear that Marcus Jackson had done more than just carry out a soldier's duty. He had sparked a movement, one that could not and would not be ignored. National Jet's corporate headquarters was now a place of quiet chaos. The phone lines were buzzing, the emails never stopped flooding in, and the pressure from the media, investors, and the general public was relentless. Inside, the board members sat around a polished oak table, their faces grim as they tried to navigate their way through the storm that had engulfed the airline. At the head of the table, Evelyn Grant, the CEO, sat with her hands clasped tightly. In front of her, staring at the screen of her laptop, her once confident and poised demeanor had been replaced with an air of defeat. She had never imagined her leadership would be tested in this way, and now the weight of the situation bore down on her with the force of a hurricane. "How did we get here?" one of the board members asked, breaking the silence. His voice, typically measured, now carried an edge of frustration. "How did we let one mistake turn into this?" Evelyn's eyes flicked up from her laptop screen. She didn't have an answer. The truth was, they had underestimated the power of social media, the unyielding voice of the public, and the collective anger of veterans and military families who had been overlooked for so long. The apology that had been hastily issued days ago had done little to calm the waters. Now, the company was fighting not just for its reputation, but for its very survival. "We can't keep pretending that this was just a simple mistake," Evelyn finally said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "It was bigger than that. This is a failure of systems, of values. We have to make real changes if we're going to salvage what's left of this company." Her words hung heavy in the room, and everyone knew it was true. The incident with Colonel Marcus Jackson had exposed a deep rot within the organization, and now it was time to reckon with the consequences outside. The protests had become a daily fixture outside National Jet's headquarters. The once muted demonstrations had morphed into full-scale rallies. Veterans, military families, and concerned citizens gathered in the street, holding signs that read, "Honor the fallen, respect our veterans, and no more silence." Their chants echoed through the city, reverberating far beyond the company's glass doors. It wasn't just a protest against National Jet anymore. It was a protest against a culture that had for too long overlooked the sacrifices made by those who served in the military, people who had once been strangers, who had never met Marcus Jackson or Private Ellis, found themselves united by a common cause. The hashtag Let Him Fly had become a rallying cry, spreading across social media like wildfire. News outlets, once focused on trivial matters, were now forced to reckon with the magnitude of what had happened. The incident had become an example of something larger, a glaring reflection of how deeply ingrained biases could manifest in the most unexpected places. Marcus Jackson, meanwhile, remained a silent force in all of this. He had completed his mission, escorting Private Ellis home and honoring his fallen comrade. The funeral had been somber and private, with only the closest family and friends in attendance. Marcus had not sought attention, nor had he wanted the media to turn its lens on him. His mission was complete, and in his mind, that was all that mattered. But despite his refusal to engage with the media or speak publicly, The nation continued to elevate him to an iconic status. His quiet dignity, his refusal to back down in the face of an unjust system, had inspired a movement. He had become the embodiment of a broader fight for respect and equality for all veterans, for all people who had been marginalized and disrespected, simply for being who they were. Marcus Jackson had become a symbol of strength, courage, and honor. Meanwhile, at National Jet's headquarters, the pressure was building to a breaking point. The board members had met several times in the past few days, trying to figure out a path forward. They knew they needed to make dramatic changes, not just in their policies, but in the way they approached customer service, employee training, and corporate culture. But no matter how many meetings they held or how many apologies they issued, it was clear that the damage had already been done. The company had failed to show basic respect for a soldier, and the public wasn't willing to let that slide. A proposal was on the table for National Jet to release a new, heartfelt apology and commitment to change. This would be coupled with the announcement of new initiatives aimed at honoring military personnel and preventing such incidents from occurring again. The airline planned to introduce a special program for veterans, offering discounts, priority boarding, and recognition for their service. They also intended to implement mandatory training for all customer service representatives and employees regarding how to treat military personnel with the utmost respect. The company was planning to overhaul its internal processes to ensure that no one, especially military personnel, would ever be humiliated like Marcus had been again. But there was a problem. Despite these efforts, many of the board members questioned whether a simple public relations campaign would be enough to restore the company's tarnished reputation. They needed more than just gestures. They needed real, systemic change, and so they began discussing a more radical option, one that would not only address the issues at hand, but would also send a message to the world. This would require more than just words. It would require action. Marcus, despite his status as the face of this movement, continued to keep his distance from the ongoing media frenzy. He had never sought the spotlight. To him, his actions were simply part of his duty, something he had sworn to do when he joined the army all those years ago. He wasn't interested in interviews or sound bites. His commitment to the mission remained unchanged. The focus had always been on the fallen soldiers he had escorted, the comrades whose sacrifices were often overshadowed by bureaucracy and neglect. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone, Marcus could feel the weight of what was happening. The calls for change were growing louder, and the conversations around him were starting to shift. It wasn't just about his experience at JFK anymore. It was about the broader issue, the systemic failure to honor military service and ensure that veterans were treated with the respect they deserved. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the fight for recognition and respect had to continue, even if it meant stepping into the limelight he had avoided one afternoon. As the protests continued to swell outside National Jet's headquarters, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was from a reporter who had been following the story closely. "Colonel Jackson," the reporter said, "we've all seen the impact your actions have had on this country. People are rallying behind you, and the demand for change is unprecedented. I know you've kept quiet throughout this process, but now the nation is listening. What do you want to say?" Marcus had to pause for a moment. He had never been one for speeches, and the thought of addressing the public in such a direct way was intimidating. But he also knew that this was no longer just about him. This was about every soldier who had been treated with indifference, every family who had lost a loved one and felt that their sacrifice had been ignored. The silence he had maintained for so long had helped galvanize the movement, but now it was time to speak. "I didn't come here for recognition," Marcus began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I didn't come here for praise. I came because a young man, Private Thomas Ellis, was denied the honor he deserved. And when I stood at that counter, I wasn't just fighting for him, I was fighting for all of us. For every soldier who has given everything for this country and never been acknowledged." His words, simple yet powerful, resonated with the nation. Marcus didn't have to shout or demand attention. His quiet strength and resolve spoke volumes. The reporter's voice cracked with emotion as he asked, "What do you think needs to change?" Marcus's response was direct. "We need to start honoring those who serve, not just in words but in actions. We need to ensure that no one is ever treated with disrespect just because of who they are. We need to hold ourselves accountable, as a society, to live up to the promises we make to our soldiers. If we don't, we fail not just them but ourselves." The interview went viral, and Marcus's words were broadcast across every major news network. For the first time, the nation was hearing from the man who had ignited the conversation, and his words struck a chord. People didn't need grand gestures. They didn't need empty promises. They needed change, real, tangible change. As the days passed, the protests outside National Jet's headquarters continued. But now the company's leadership was beginning to take action. After much deliberation, Evelyn Grant made the decision to step down. It was a painful but necessary move. The company needed new leadership, someone who could steer it toward the kind of change that was needed. The board quickly appointed an interim CEO, someone with a background in corporate responsibility and a clear vision for reshaping the company's approach to veterans and customer service. National Jet made a public commitment to overhaul its policies and its culture. They pledged to implement the most comprehensive training program in the airline industry, one that would prioritize respect for military personnel and ensure that no one would ever again face the kind of mistreatment that Marcus had endured. The airline also announced that it would be dedicating significant resources to supporting veterans, including partnerships with veteran organizations and initiatives to provide more accessible flight options for military families. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wouldn't undo the damage that had been done, but it was a start. And it was clear that the message had been received. National Jet's efforts to rebuild were ongoing, but the story of Marcus Jackson and Private Ellis would never be forgotten. The public's eyes were now open, and the conversation had shifted. The treatment of veterans, the respect owed to those who serve, and the accountability of companies and institutions were all part of a new dialogue, a dialogue that would continue long after the protests outside National Jet's headquarters had faded. As for Marcus, he continued to live his life in quiet dignity, carrying out the duties he had sworn to uphold. The nation had seen him stand firm, and they had seen him fight not for glory, but for the honor of those who could no longer speak. In the end, it wasn't about the accolades or recognition. It was about doing what was right. And in that quiet resolve, Marcus Jackson had shown the world what true honor looked like.